Along the wide and sacred waters of the Ganges River, where morning mist rises slowly into the light, ancient voices once carried across the current in rhythmic chant. The words moved through the air like breath itself, unhurried, deliberate, rooted in something older than memory. Those who sat beside the water in those distant mornings were not simply praying. They were listening, listening to the river, listening to the sound beneath silence, listening for the shape of something they believed was woven into everything, into the motion of water, the turning of seasons, the choices made by ordinary human hands. This is the story of a tradition so ancient that even its oldest recorded words carry the feeling of something that had already been known for a very long time before anyone thought to write them down. Welcome to First Beliefs. Tonight, we sit quietly beside the Ganges in the long dusk of ancient India, and we follow the early stirrings of one of the world's most enduring philosophical and spiritual traditions. We follow the birth of karma, the river, and the sacred world. The Ganges River moves southward and eastward across the plains of northern India, fed by glacial melt and monsoon rains, winding for nearly 2,500 kilometers before it meets the sea. For as long as people have lived along its banks, the river has been understood as something more than geography. It has been felt as presence. Ancient texts from the early Vedic period, composed somewhere between 3,500 and 2,500 years ago, describe the rivers of northern India and the Ganges most especially as living divine forces. They were addressed by name, they were thanked, they were asked for blessing. The relationship between the early communities of the Indus and Ganges plains and the waters that sustained them was not simply practical, it was devotional. In the earliest layer of Vedic thought, the world was understood to be alive with meaning. The rain was not random. The fire was not merely chemical. The rising of the sun each morning was not mechanical. These were expressions of something larger of forces, intelligences, and presences that moved through the world and that could be engaged, honored, and listened to through the practice of ritual. The people who would eventually come to be associated with the earliest forms of what we now call Hinduism were not a single group with a single origin. Early thinkers and historians suggest that the tradition emerged from a gradual blending of cultures, including the communities of the ancient Indus Valley civilization, among the oldest urban cultures in the world, and the pastoralist peoples who moved into the subcontinent from the northwest sometime in the second millennium before the Common Era. What arose from that slow blending was something remarkable, a layered, complex, deeply reflective way of understanding existence. And at the heart of that understanding was a simple but profound question. Why do things happen the way they do? It is a question that every human culture has asked in every age. But the answers that emerged slowly and organically along the banks of the Ganges over the course of many centuries would eventually become some of the most subtle and enduring philosophical ideas the world has ever known. The river carries all of this, as rivers do, taking what is offered, moving forward, returning at last to the sea. The sound of the Vedas. Imagine sitting in the very early morning before the sun has fully risen. The air is cool and carries the smell of water and earth. Somewhere nearby, perhaps beneath a tree or beside a small, carefully tended fire, a teacher sits with students gathered around. And from the teacher's lips, slowly and precisely, words begin to move into the air. These words are ancient. They were ancient even then. The Vedas, a collection of sacred texts whose name derives from a word meaning knowledge or wisdom, represent the earliest surviving literature of the tradition. They are composed in an early form of Sanskrit, a language of extraordinary precision and beauty. Ancient tradition held that the Vedas were not composed by human beings at all, but were instead received heard by ancient sages, called rishis, in states of deep inner stillness. The word often used to describe the sages who received these texts means one who sees. They were seers, listeners of deep attention. The four primary Vedic collections were known as the Rig Veda, the Samaveda, the Yajurveda, and the Atharveda. The Rig Veda is the oldest of these, containing over 1,000 hymns addressed to various divine forces: fire, wind, dawn, the sun, and countless others. These hymns were not read silently. They were sung, chanted. The sound itself was considered sacred, and the precision of pronunciation was treated with enormous care. A mispronounced syllable was understood to disrupt the harmony of what was being invoked. This deep relationship with sound is one of the most distinctive features of early Vedic spirituality. The universe itself, ancient teachers suggested, had its roots in vibration, in something resembling what we might call a primordial sound. The universe was, in some sense, spoken into being. And by correctly reproducing those sounds through chant, through mantra, through the careful art of sacred speech, human beings could align themselves with the order underlying all things. That order had a name. It was called Rita in the earliest Vedic texts, a word that carries meanings of truth, rightness, and cosmic harmony. The world moved according to Rita. The seasons returned because of it. The rivers ran, the sun crossed the sky, and human beings, these early thinkers suggested, were called to live in harmony with this order rather than against it. This is the first seed of what would eventually grow into something far more elaborated, the concept of Dharma. The ritual world and its meaning. For many centuries, Vedic religion was centered on ritual. The fire sacrifice known as yajna was one of the central acts of Vedic spiritual life. Performed by trained priests called Brahmins, these rituals were complex, extended ceremonies in which offerings of clarified butter, grain, and soma, a sacred plant preparation, were made to the fire. The fire itself was understood as a messenger, carrying the offerings from the human world upward to the divine forces being invoked. The rituals served many purposes. Some were communal, performed to ensure rain, abundant harvest, or protection in war. Some were seasonal, marking the turning points of the year. Some were personal, performed at births, marriages, deaths. And some were deeply philosophical, performed not for any worldly outcome, but as a form of alignment with the cosmic order itself. The priests who performed these rituals occupied a central position in early Vedic society. Their knowledge was specialized, their training long and demanding. The correct performance of a ritual required years of memorization and practice. And because the stakes were understood to be real, because the well-being of communities was believed to rest on the correct maintenance of these sacred acts, the priests carried both enormous responsibility and considerable social weight. But over time, questions began to arise. Thoughtful individuals, both within and beyond the priestly class, began to look more deeply at what the ritual was pointing toward. If the fire sacrifice maintained cosmic harmony, they asked, what was cosmic harmony exactly? If the chants invoked divine forces, what were those forces at their deepest root? If the universe was governed by order, Where did that order come from? And what was the human being's place within it? These questions did not arrive suddenly. They arrived slowly, the way understanding usually does, through long reflection, through conversation beside rivers and beneath trees, through the patient accumulation of thought across many generations. And gradually, between roughly 800 and 200 years before the Common Era, a body of texts emerged that would carry these questions forward into a new kind of depth. These texts were called the Upanishads. The Upanishads and the turning inward. The word Upanishad suggests something like sitting close to. It carries the image of a student sitting near a teacher, close enough to listen, close enough to receive something that could not be shouted across a distance, but needed to be shared in intimacy and stillness. The Upanishads are philosophical dialogues, meditations, and reflections, sometimes lyrical, sometimes sharply logical, always deeply earnest in their inquiry. They do not replace the earlier Vedic tradition. They grow from within it, like leaves from an old and deep-rooted tree, but they shift the center of gravity. Where the earlier Vedas focused outward on ritual, on invoking divine forces, on maintaining cosmic order through sacred action, the Upanishads turn inward. What is the self, they ask? What is consciousness? What is the reality underlying the appearances of the world? And what is the relationship between the self within and the order without? Ancient Upanishadic teachers reflected that the deepest reality of the individual, the innermost awareness that witnesses all experience, was not separate from the deepest reality of the universe itself. This innermost self, called Atman, and the ultimate ground of being, called Brahman, were understood in many of these texts to be, at the deepest level, one and the same. The boundary between inner and outer, between self and world, was not ultimately fixed. It was a kind of appearance real in everyday experience, but not the final truth. This was a profound and subtle idea. It suggested that the distance human beings felt between themselves and the universe, the loneliness, the separateness, the sense of being small and adrift, was not a permanent condition. It was more like a kind of forgetting. And the spiritual life, these teachers suggested, was a process of remembering. But how does one forget? And how does one remember? This is where the ideas of karma, dharma, and samsara enter the story, not as rules handed down from above, but as observations about how existence actually seems to work, made by people who were paying very close, very patient attention. Dharma, the path of right action. Before we reach karma, we must spend some time with dharma. The two are closely related, inseparable, really, but dharma comes first, in a certain sense. It is the ground on which karma walks. Dharma is one of those words that resists easy translation. It carries multiple layers of meaning simultaneously. It can mean duty, it can mean right action. It can mean order, natural law, truth, or the appropriate way of living in accordance with one's nature and circumstances. In the widest sense, Dharma is the order that underlies the universe, the principle that things hold together, that the world makes sense, that there is a way things should be done. Early thinkers described Dharma not as an external rule book, but as something more like a quality of existence, something woven into the fabric of reality, the way gravity is woven into the fabric of space. Just as a river naturally flows downhill, living beings in this understanding have a natural movement, a way of being that is in harmony with what they are, with what surrounds them, and with the larger order of things. For an individual, Dharma was understood to be shaped by several factors, by one's role in the community, by one's stage of life, by the particular circumstances of one's existence. A student's Dharma was different from a parent's Dharma. A teacher's Dharma was different from a farmer's Dharma. But across all these differences, something remained constant: the call toward right action, toward honesty, toward compassion, toward the kind of behavior that supported rather than disrupted the order of things. Ancient texts suggest that failing to live in accordance with Dharma was not simply a moral failing, it was a kind of disharmony, a disturbance in the pattern. The way a stone dropped into still water sends ripples outward in all directions. And this image of action sending ripples outward, of every choice creating consequences that move through time, leads us directly to karma. The birth of karma. The word karma comes from a Sanskrit root meaning action or to do. In its earliest Vedic usage, it referred specifically to ritual action, the performance of sacred rites. But over the centuries of philosophical reflection that produced the Upanishads, karma evolved into something far broader and far more personal. It became a way of understanding the relationship between all action and all consequence, not just in the context of ritual, but in the context of every moment of every life. The basic teaching of karma, as early thinkers reflected upon it, is elegant in its simplicity. Every action has consequences, and those consequences in turn shape future conditions. This is not a supernatural doctrine in the first instance, it is closer to a philosophical observation about how existence seems to work. Actions matter, choices shape the world. What we do echoes forward through time. But Vedic and Upanishadic thought extended this principle beyond the obvious and immediate. It was not only the outward consequences of action that mattered, the effects on others, the changes in the world. It was the interior effect of action on the one who acted. Every choice, these early thinkers suggested, leaves a trace, not just in the world, but within. The mind and character of a person are shaped, gradually and continuously, by the choices they make. A person who acts with compassion repeatedly becomes, over time, more compassionate. A person who acts with cruelty becomes, over time, harder and more closed. Action shapes the actor. This interior dimension of karma is one of its most profound aspects. It means that karma is not simply about reward and punishment in some external accounting system. It is about the way that who we are emerges from what we do. The self is not fixed. It is in motion, shaped moment by the actions it chooses and the intentions it carries. Intentions in early karmic philosophy mattered enormously. Ancient texts suggest that karma was understood to flow not just from actions in the physical sense from what one does, but from the quality of mind and heart from which an action arises. An act of generosity performed from genuine care created different consequences than the same act performed out of desire for recognition. The outer form could be identical, but the inner quality, the intention, shaped the karmic weight of what was done. This was a deeply humane and subtle teaching. It placed moral life not in compliance with external rules, but in the cultivation of inner awareness, in the gradual refinement of the quality of attention and intention from which all action flows. The river of life's samsara. To fully understand karma, we need to understand the context in which early thinkers placed it. And that context is samsara, a word that means flowing together or continuous movement. It is the word used to describe the cycle of birth, life, death, and rebirth that, in this understanding, all living beings are seen to move through. The idea that the self does not simply end at physical death, that something continues, moving forward into new conditions, new lives, is one of the central and distinctive features of this tradition. Ancient teachers reflected that the individual self, the stream of consciousness and karmic tendency, carries forward beyond the death of a particular body and eventually arises again in a new form, shaped by the accumulated consequences of all previous actions. This is a vast and in some ways vertiginous idea. It stretches the scale of moral life far beyond a single lifetime. It suggests that the consequences of action are not always immediate, that they may unfold slowly across enormous spans of time, and it suggests that the circumstances of any given life, its joys and its difficulties, its particular shape and weight, are not arbitrary or random, but carry the imprint of what has come before. It is important to be careful here. Early teachers did not present samsara as a fatalistic doctrine, as a teaching that what happens to us is simply what we deserve, or that suffering is somehow earned in any simple or judgmental sense. The tradition was far more nuanced than that. Karma, these thinkers reflected, is not a perfect ledger of debts and credits. It is more like a living, dynamic stream flowing, shifting, shaped by an almost incomprehensible accumulation of causes and conditions. The human being is not at the mercy of karma. The human being can shape it, redirect it, through the quality of awareness and intention brought to each present moment. This is a crucial point. Samsara is not a prison. It is described in the tradition more like a current powerful, yes, and deeply conditioned by what has come before, but navigable. The human life, in this understanding, is a remarkable opportunity. It is a moment of relative awareness, a window of consciousness in which genuine reflection and genuine transformation are possible. And that transformation, carried far enough, points towards something the tradition would come to call moksha. The light of moksha. If samsara is the river of continuous becoming, the flowing cycle of birth and death and birth again, then moksha is the word for what lies beyond that cycle. It means liberation, release, freedom. It is one of the most carefully considered and deeply felt concepts in the entire tradition. Ancient teachers reflected that the root of the cycle of samsara, the energy that keeps the wheel turning, is a particular kind of not knowing. In Sanskrit, this not knowing is called avidya, and it means something like ignorance or misperception. Not simple ignorance of facts or information, but a deeper, subtler confusion about the nature of things. A confusion about what we truly are. In the Upanishadic understanding, the deepest truth about the self is that it is not separate from the ground of being, that the innermost awareness within each being is, in its deepest nature, one with the underlying reality of the universe. But this truth is not ordinarily experienced. Instead, most conscious beings move through life with the felt sense that they are small, separate, bounded, that they are this particular body, this particular history, this particular bundle of desires and fears. And from that sense of separateness arise attachment, aversion, craving, and all the movements of the mind that generate karma and sustain the cycle of return. Moksha, in this understanding, is what becomes possible when the veil of misperception begins to thin, when the deepest nature of awareness begins to be directly known rather than merely believed. Ancient texts suggest that the individual who achieves this liberation does not simply gain something new. Rather, they recognize something that was always already present, a quality of awareness that was never actually limited, never actually separate, never actually bound by the forces of karma and return. This is a teaching of extraordinary subtlety. It is not a claim about what happens after death in any simple narrative sense. It is a claim about the nature of awareness itself, about what is discovered when the usual movements of mind settle into deep stillness. Early Upanishadic teachers explored many approaches to this stillness. Some spoke of philosophical inquiry, the careful examination of the nature of experience until the truth of things became clear. Some spoke of ethical life as a preparation, the gradual purification of action and intention that creates the inner conditions for deeper understanding. Some spoke of meditation, the direct training of attention into stillness and clarity. And some spoke of devotion, the opening of the heart towards something larger than the small separate self. These paths would be elaborated and developed over many centuries of subsequent tradition. But their roots are here, in these early conversations beside the river, in these quiet dialogues between teachers and students who were asking, with enormous seriousness and care, what it means to be alive and what it might mean to be free. The world of the early seeker. We have been moving through ideas. Let us return for a moment to the world in which those ideas were being lived and breathed. The great river plain of northern India, in the centuries when the Upanishads were being composed and passed from teacher to student, was a world of remarkable cultural richness and complexity. Cities were growing. Trade routes were lengthening. Different communities with different languages and customs were coming into contact. New ideas were moving through the region with the energy of a time in which many old certainties were being questioned and many new possibilities were being imagined. This period, roughly between 800 and 400 years before the Common Era, is sometimes called the Axial Age by historians of religion, because it was a time when, in several different parts of the world simultaneously, human cultures seemed to have turned inward in a new way. In China, thinkers like Confucius and Laozi were reflecting on the nature of virtue and the way of things. In Greece, philosophers were asking radical questions about knowledge, justice, and the structure of reality. In the Middle East, prophets were calling for a deepened moral and spiritual life. And in India, the Upanishadic teachers and their contemporaries, including in this same period, the historical figures who would found Buddhism and Jainism, were exploring the nature of consciousness and the conditions for human liberation. Something was happening in this era across the whole of the ancient world, a deepening of philosophical and ethical reflection, a turn toward inner experience as a source of understanding, a questioning of inherited traditions in search of something more direct and more alive. The forests and riverbanks of the Ganges plain were full of seekers in this time. Ancient texts describe wandering teachers called shramanas who had left behind the conventional life of householder and ritual to pursue inner inquiry in full-time earnestness. These wandering philosophers moved through the landscape, gathering students, debating with one another, sitting in long meditation beside rivers and beneath trees. They were an extraordinary phenomenon individuals who had decided that understanding the nature of existence was worth more than comfort, stability, or social position. The early tradition of what we now call Hinduism held a deep respect for this kind of seeking. The concept of the ashrama, the stage of life, made provision for the human being to eventually leave behind worldly roles and move into deeper contemplative inquiry. A life well lived in this understanding was a life that moved gradually toward increasing depth of awareness from student to householder to one who begins to withdraw from the world to one who moves in full freedom, seeking only the deepest understanding. This was a vision of human life as a spiritual journey, long, patient, unfolding across decades and in the full karmic understanding across many lifetimes. Action without grasping. One of the most striking and practically influential ideas to emerge from early Hindu philosophical thought is the teaching of action performed without attachment to its fruits. This idea, which would later be elaborated with great beauty in a text called the Bhagavad Gita, composed somewhere in the centuries before the Common Era, addresses one of the deepest tensions in the understanding of karma. If every action creates karmic consequence, and if those consequences bind the actor to the ongoing cycle of return, then what is the relationship between living an active life and moving toward liberation? Must a person withdraw entirely from action in order to become free? Early thinkers reflected that the problem was not action itself. The world requires action. Life requires engagement. The parent must care for the child. The farmer must tend the field. The student must learn. The teacher must teach. Action is not the problem. The problem, these thinkers suggested, is the quality of grasping that so often accompanies action, the clinging to outcomes, the anxiety about results, the way that desire and fear so frequently color and distort the quality of what we do. When action arises from this place of grasping, when it is driven by the urgency of getting what we want or avoiding what we fear, it carries a weight that binds. But when action arises from a place of clarity and openness, when it is done simply because it is the right thing to do in this moment, without an anxious grip on how it will turn out, it has a different quality altogether. It is lighter, it does not bind in the same way. Ancient texts suggest that this teaching was not about passivity or indifference. It was not about failing to care about outcomes. It was about a subtler kind of caring, one that acts with full presence and full effort, but without the desperate need for things to turn out in a particular way. It is the difference between giving, because giving is the right thing to do, and giving in order to receive gratitude or recognition. The outer form of the action is the same. The inner quality is entirely different. This teaching resonated deeply, and it speaks to something universal in human experience, the way that anxiety about outcomes can poison the quality of our actions, and the way that a certain inner spaciousness can allow us to act more freely, more generously, and more effectively. The sound beneath sound. There is something that the early Vedic tradition understood about the nature of chant that is worth resting with for a moment. It is not simply that chanting was a practice, a technique performed in order to achieve some result. It was understood as a form of listening. The chant was a way of tuning the instrument of the mind and body to something that was already present, something that did not need to be created, only recognized. Ancient teachers spoke of a sound called nada or pranava that was not produced by any instrument or any human voice, but that underlay all sound. The sacred syllable known as Om was understood as the closest approach human speech could make to this primordial vibration. It was chanted at the beginning and end of sacred recitations, and its meaning was understood to be not a word in the conventional sense, but a gesture toward the ground of being itself. When a person sat beside the Ganges at dawn and allowed the sound of the river to move through them, and allowed the chant to arise from deep within, and allowed the movement of breath and attention to settle into stillness, something was available in that moment that ordinary busy consciousness could not reach. Not a revelation from outside, not a message delivered from another place, something recognized from within. This is what the early teachers were pointing toward. Not information about the divine, but direct encounter with the ground of being available, they suggested, in the stillness of attention, in the quality of full presence brought to the simplest moment. The river was always there. The sound was always there. The awareness that could recognize these things that was always there too. The legacy that flows forward. The ideas that emerged from these centuries of inquiry beside the rivers of ancient India did not remain confined to those riverbanks. They moved. They traveled through time, through conversation, through written texts, through the lives of countless individuals who found in them something that spoke to what they most deeply knew or most urgently sought. The philosophical concepts of karma, dharma, samsara, and moksha became not just the foundation of what we now call Hinduism, but through closely related traditions that emerged in this same period and placed the foundation of Buddhism, Jainism, and many other streams of Indian thought. The ideas traveled along trade routes into Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and eventually into conversation with philosophical and spiritual traditions across the world. What endured was not just a set of beliefs, it was a quality of question. The question of how to live, how to act in a way that is genuinely aligned with the deep order of things, how to bring one's inner life into harmony with the world, how to move through the inevitable suffering of existence without being destroyed by it, and how to open toward whatever might lie beneath and beyond the ordinary surface of experience. These questions did not age. They did not become irrelevant. They remained as alive and as urgent in every generation as they were when the first rishis sat beside the river and listened. The tradition that emerged from this long inquiry is not a closed or finished thing. It continued to grow, elaborate, debate, and deepen across the centuries that followed. New texts were composed. New teachers arose. New forms of practice and understanding emerged. But at the root of all of it, the long, patient, living root, were these early reflections beside the Ganges. These early questions, this early listening, sitting with the river. We are nearing the end of our time together tonight, and so let us return to where we began, to the river. The Ganges rises in the high Himalayas from a glacier whose ancient Sanskrit name means something like the cow's mouth, the source of the sacred, life-giving flow. It moves downward through the mountains and emerges onto the vast plain, widening and slowing as it goes, gathering tributaries, moving past ancient cities that have stood on its banks for millennia, until at last it reaches the great delta and merges with the sea. For the people who have lived along its banks across countless generations, this river has never been merely a river. It has been a teacher. It has been an image of time, always moving, always returning, carrying everything forward and leaving nothing behind unchanged. Ancient texts speak of the Ganges as purifying not just the body but the spirit. There is something in the image of flowing water that the human mind recognizes as true about its own deepest nature. The mind, too, flows. Attention moves. The self is not fixed but always in motion, always becoming, always arriving at the present moment from the long distance of everything that has come before. The early Vedic seers understood this. The Upanishadic teachers understood this. The wandering philosophers who sat in the forest and questioned the nature of everything understood this. What they were all reaching toward through ritual, through chant, through philosophical inquiry, through meditation, through ethical life was a direct encounter with the nature of that flow. Not from outside it, not as observers of something happening elsewhere, but from within it as the river knows its own water. Karma, in this understanding, is not a punishment or a reward. It is the shape that the river takes as it moves, shaped by the ground beneath, by the rains that fall, by the choices made at every confluence and turn. Every action is a movement of the water. Every intention is a change in direction, and the whole long journey across many lives, if the tradition is to be believed, or across the single life we know we have, is a movement toward the sea, toward something vast and undivided, toward what the early teachers called by many names and what, they suggested, is finally beyond all names. The river does not stop. As this evening draws gently to a close, and as the words of these ancient voices soften and grow still, there is something quietly remarkable in the fact that these ideas are still with us, that they still move. Somewhere tonight, beside the Ganges, there is someone sitting in the early dark, listening to the water. The sound of the river is the same sound it has always made patient, continuous, neither hurrying nor stopping. Somewhere, a chant is rising in the cool air, syllables that have been passed from voice to voice across more than 3,000 years, still carrying something of what they have always carried. Somewhere, a student is sitting close to a teacher, listening for something that cannot be shouted from a distance. The questions are the same questions. How should I live? What are the consequences of my choices? What is this awareness that watches and wonders and seeks? What lies beyond the ordinary surface of things? The tradition does not claim that these questions have simple answers. It does not claim that the path is short or easy. It asks only that we take the questions seriously, that we sit with them, as the early teachers sat with them, with patience and honesty and genuine care for what is true. Karma does not demand perfection. It asks only for awareness. Dharma does not demand certainty. It asks only for sincerity. Samsara does not demand that we escape immediately. It asks only that we notice where we are and move, however slowly, in the direction of greater understanding. And moksha, that word for liberation that the ancient teachers pointed toward with such careful and reverent attention, may be less like a destination at the end of a long journey and more like a quality of light that has always been present, waiting to be seen. The river flows, the chant continues, the cycle turns. This has been First Beliefs. Thank you for sitting quietly with us tonight beside the ancient water. Until next time, may your attention be gentle and your questions deep.